Nick, can you?
Yeah, testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Test, test, test. You got sound?
You got sound? I want.
You got the count?
Yeah. Let me know when you're ready.
I'm ready whenever you are.
Okay, I've got camera rolling, camera rolling.
Camera's rolling, audio on.
All right, we're going live in
Okay,
3, 2.
And welcome back. We're going to get through this American government bit pretty quickly. I just really want to focus on a bit of the dysfunction. I'd mentioned some of the things going on in the legislative branch, and where I left off was talking about the lack of the experienced staff. Now, I want to make one slight correction there in terms of clarity. There's always someone on the new congressman or senator staff from somewhere else, the experienced one, to help out. Now, most of the systems that are set up are called closed loops. Nothing ever really makes it to the congressman. All of your letters and correspondences and handwritten notes and all that get in the loop, and then a response is generated, but the congressman likely never sees any of them. Some of them never see any of them. They don't see what comes in and they don't see what goes out. They don't see any of it. They're not in the loop. You're the only one in the loop, and some staff person. And then the people that get in to see the congressman are lobbyists, and that's by the gatekeepers at the door, or their friends where they have other numbers and ways to reach people. But the access is highly controlled. You really don't have the influence you think you do with most of them. And that's a sad miscarriage of the legislature, because if you can't access them and they're not representing you well, then what are you going to do? And the parties pick a lot of these people not because they know anything, but they'll do what they're told, and they know just enough to look good on a camera and get elected. They just make a good pitch guy who can read a good script and can follow his instructions. Now, there are real leaders too. They're out there. They're just rare, but they're out there. But the lack of good representation and being able to see good leadership in action, they don't have very many good teachers. So they end up being in the minority. Hopefully they stay and they get things done, but a lot of them leave because they can't get anything done because it's deadlocked, gridlocked. Now they're abandoning old systems because they've created such a state of lack of cooperation that they can't even talk to each other. This is wrong. This is not American justice as it was planned out in terms of how we run our legislature. But going back on to dysfunction, that's enough about the Congress. I've talked enough about the executive. Let's talk about the unjust system of the justice system. Because the one thing we all know about the justice system is you better have a lot of money if you want to play there. And I really mean that. In fact, the last time I got called to jury duty, the judge and I decided we didn't see it the same way. And you know, they always do the pre-jury pool thing. And the judge, in Alaska at least, they do this. They ask you as part of the question deal is there anybody here that would not be willing to follow one of my orders? Now, I thought about that, and I had to raise my hand, because I thought, well, what order is he going to give? Is he just asking me for a blank check? And I kind of felt like I did with that Catholic priest trying to talk to me about faith. Maybe this guy didn't know what he was really asking me, and I just need a little clarification, and maybe it's me just not understanding. But here's what happens when you raise your hand at a time like that, and there's a big pool of jurors. They don't want you to pollute the jury pool with your ideas, so they shuffle you out into the hallway with the judge and a representative of each side of the case, the lawyers involved. So you got the little prosecutor and the defense attorney, because we were doing a criminal case. It was a murder case, as a matter of fact, so it was going to be one of these serious things. So we're in the hallway with the judge, and the judge says, he was very mad. He had a pretty red face, and he was standing there in that black dress talking to me, and I thought that was kind of odd, But anyway, I entertained him with the answers that he was hopefully looking for. When he asked me, he said, "Why won't you follow my orders?" And I said, No, I didn't say that, Your Honor. I'll follow any just order that you give. And he goes, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "Just what I said, Your Honor. I'll follow any just order that you give, and I'm sure you're a just judge." And he asked me a third time, getting a little redder in the face, and I answered it the same way again, watching behind him over his shoulder the defense and the prosecuting attorney, getting a bit of humor out of the whole thing, pissing that judge off, because I wasn't going to be probably sitting before him, hopefully ever. But in that conversation with the judge, he asked me the one fatal question that kind of, I think, killed it for me being on that jury. He asked me, "Is there anything else, Mr. Begich?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, now that you ask, Your Honor, there is." I said, "Looking at the situation here, and no disrespect for the attorneys involved, but I see a guy being charged with murder, having a public defender. And then I see the prosecutor on the other side, and he's got kind of unlimited resources because he works for the government. The defense attorney is, on the other hand, no offense to you, sir, I'm sure you can do a fine job, but you know, somehow it's a little different for the job he's going to get, because I believe that the man on that defense table with that lawyer, he doesn't have a very thick wallet, and I think American justice today, Your Honor, has a direct proportional relationship to the thickness of your wallet, and that man's wallet is too thin. So if I'm sitting on this jury, I'm going to be weighting heavily in the defendant's corner, because I know he's already outgunned by fighting the state. He only has a public defender, and I know how taxed they are and overworked they are, so no offense, but I got to give the man a little extra weight in the presumption of innocence if I'm going to be on your jury. But I'm sure every just order you give, I'm going to follow." And he was very angry. We went back in the courtroom, and he made me sit there for another half hour until he finally told me to get lost. But the point is, what happened in the South when juries were called in cases in the early 60s and judges were given orders? Sometimes judges might not give just orders, and if all I'm going to do is follow a judge's orders, they don't need me for a juror, because I thought I was going to be there to judge the fairness of the law as applied to the evidence in the case in front of me. And that's what a jury does, not follow orders. They decide if law is just. That's what they do. So the justice system isn't just because you have to be rich to get in, and you don't need to socialize medicine, you need to socialize lawyers. You need to put them all on the payroll to represent everyone equally. And I told you how to decongest the courtrooms earlier when we deal with divorces. Don't have them anymore. Negotiate them up front before you get married. If you missed that section, you got to go back and find it. It's in an early part of this broadcast. But the idea was simple. You know, how do you decongest courts? What can we do differently? How can you simplify things? These are all questions that we're entitled to, because the one thing every American's entitled to is justice. Now, in the law, we have laws against copyright infringement. People violate copyrights all the time, yet we scream at China for violating our intellectual property rights. This government does nothing unless you're Bill Gates and a big corporation. They do nothing to protect your intellectual property rights. 1.5 million of my books were given away electronically. When I went to the government, they said, "Go sue somebody." I'm not doing that. I don't have time for that. I just quit writing books. That's what I did. I dumped 10 books worth of research in the dump. It wasn't economic to write them and spend 2 years doing that to have them just gone. So I couldn't do it. My government says, "Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's criminal, but we're not going to do anything about it. Yeah, it's criminal, but too bad." You see all the little statement, the FBI will beat you up for stealing videos. You know, it shows it on the first of all those videos you watch. No, they won't. Not unless you're the big guy. Then they will. No, there's no justice unless you're rich. Don't think there is. Don't fool yourself into that. But we should have justice, which means we need a simpler system that's accessible to everyone, whether it's civil or criminal law. And if this government is going to make criminal laws and put them on the books, then they need to enforce them. Otherwise, take them off the books and let's just let it go and just say we're not going to do it. But then don't beat up China and say they don't protect. You don't protect my intellectual property, U.S. government. China steals it too. You just let everybody steal it. Even when you have jurisdiction right here, you don't enforce the law, you just beat up the other guy for not enforcing it too. Hypocrisy throughout. That's what everyone's sick of in this country, for sure. all the way through. That's why we don't have trust in our. We need to extend whistleblowing. We need to extend the Freedom of Information Act to all government contractors taking federal money. They need to be subject to the same inquiry, the level of inquiry of transparency that deserves in the 21st century. We need to fix the holes in the laws to make our government transparent, turn the cameras on government wherever they can face inward, and see whether it's a coffee break or a project that's getting done. We have a right to know what our employees are doing. We need rewards for whistleblowing, ways for people to come through this. We need ombudsmen with subpoena power to go in and investigate government effectively and report to the public what's going on. We need representative government with whistleblowing capacity to go in to the most secret parts of government to see if we're being screwed over by our government. We need to redo this thing and create rewards for people being honest, and we need to break down the barriers that have kept us from an honest government. And that's big corporations with too much influence, big unions, big nonprofits, too much bigness telling us what to do. It needs to change, and it needs to come back to us. But we have to find our own power first. That's where we started if we're ever going to get our government back. Because they took that from us to make sure we didn't. And you got to remember it. As you look at China and Russia, which is the next part of this, I want to jump into it. I've already talked a bit about China and how the social control mechanisms are coming into place, even more so than ever. But China's not foolish. You know, they've been divesting themselves of US dollars and buying assets all over the world, and people have been laughing at them for decades. You're paying 15, 20% too much, 10% too much. No, they're not. They know those dollars are just toilet paper that hurts. They know eventually they're not going to be worth what they are. They'd rather own hard assets. And then they move their teams in to work with those governments. They move their people in to influence those governments. And they start taking control of the Silk Road, which is the new way that the Chinese recapture what they had for thousands of years. It's only been the last couple hundred. They haven't been in control. China had it all for a lot of the world for a very long time, and they would like it back. I have a whole rack of books there I talked about earlier in the very beginning of this that deal with China, the modern era and in ages past. One of the key elements of Chinese thinking is the art of war, which is to fight wars without shooting bullets in the modern context. It's how to fight a war without firing a shot or pulling a sword, how to get finesse through conflict in a way that is elegant and is 3,000 years old. They're applying it right now. They apply it in economics, in warfare, in everything. It's a way of being. It's a cultural understanding. Just like the poetry of China, if you read it. Just like the philosophy, the deep philosophy of China, if you read it. The energetic knowledge of China, the spiritual depth of the Chinese people goes deep, and the Chinese government is scared to death of it. Every time a religious movement grows in China, the Chinese government freaks out. Whether it's Gong, whether it's Tai Chi, whether it's the Muslim faith or Christians, they don't want anything. Because they know, too, what we know, is what is in a human being scares the heck out of people that have been screwed. Amplify that while you're around to do it and you have time and space. The Chinese are after the same thing, the heart of their people. You know, think about it. It's about control, it's about manipulation, it's about a lot of things. And I'm sure everyone doing those things in their part of the world believe they're doing it for the right reasons. And it's up to the people in that part of the world to decide whether they're right. Now, China's kind of broken up. You have Taiwan, which is independent. You have China, the mainland. And you have Hong Kong, which we've heard a lot about lately. That's going to go away as we used to know it pretty quickly. Taiwan feels very threatened for all the right reasons. The world is an unstable place. China wants to be in charge. They can do a lot more with their military than we can, and let me tell you why. To build one aircraft carrier in the U.S., China can build 10 for the same money in half the time, because they don't have the regulation. over the people doing it or anything else. They just get it done. Go look in the ports of China at what they've built in a fleet in the last 40 years. And we paid for all that by buying all those widgets and doing all the things. And Nixon and Kissinger started that when they closed the gold window and opened the door to China. And when you look back at those historic pictures, they were all riding bicycles in China. Bicycles. And horses they were using in the countryside where they weren't modern enough to have bicycles. Look now. They're going to be the biggest economy in the world. It's not going to take them long. They're dumping the US dollar and they're making their deals with Russia and in Asia. They've set up their own banking. They set up their own international transaction system away from the SWIFT system that the West controlled, that the US controlled. They're breaking off the economics, and those dollars aren't going to be sucked up over there. Saudis, Middle Easterners doing the same, getting away from the dollar as much as they can. Why are they doing that? Maybe it's a bad bet now. Maybe the growth is in Asia now. Maybe it's in Russia now. Look at Russia on a map at how big it is. They have a declining population and one of the richest resource bases you could ever imagine. And at their southern border is China with a huge population and a lack of resources. It's a match made in heaven for them, and they've agreed to exchange it on their own currencies and not the US dollar. They're building railroads and ports in a fraction of the time at a fraction of the cost. They're going to change the distribution of raw goods and finished goods and take a flood of raw materials out of the former Soviet Union and its republics. Why did Russia weren't? And so Russians, European Russians, are a lot like Americans were in the 50s towards other races. They're very, very bigoted. I mean, and they are. I mean, they don't like it. I saw ads. Okay, you read the American paper and it has ads, you know, in English, and it's the ads for apartments and the kinds of things that it would say. And this just a few years ago, it'd say nobody from the Caucasus. In other words, nobody of color allowed. And it would say, looking for a woman roommate, only have to have sex occasionally. You know, that kind of thing. Actually in the ads. I mean, in ads today in the 21st century, right? I mean, that's ads in Russia. Correct, it's expected. So cultures run way differently. Even Russia runs way differently, a lot of people know. It does. People are different everywhere I go. It's kind of interesting. But when I think about Russia, Russia has a deep spiritual depth also. In fact, a lot of the Russian scientific research was a lot further ahead in sort of the parasciences. We followed their lead in a lot of these areas. Alexander Kavarenin, the biophysicist I mentioned, what stimulated him in the very beginning of his career and of his life as a genius, a really, really genius, one of the top 5 biophysicists in the world, was watching the demonstration of the paranormal. It was eyeless sight, where blind kids were putting their hand over images and telling what they were in words and reading them because of the vibration, as I explained light earlier today, coming off of them. They could detect it with their hands and discern that. You can learn how to do this. There is a difference. It takes training. With kids at a certain age, it happens easy because the pituitary gland is the most developed, the largest, and has something to do with this, at least according to the Russian research. So Russian research is really interesting. I think there's, having known lots of Russians, I spend time there every once in a while. Russian people are very similar to us in a lot of other ways, but they live in a very present moment. They don't believe that tomorrow offers them much, and they certainly don't think the past did. So they live for the moment. So they live a full, rich life, not knowing what tomorrow might bring. Just in the time I've worked in and out of there in different projects, their value of their currencies dropped in half like overnight, twice, where everything they had in savings all of a sudden could buy a half a loaf of bread, a half a car. If they just bought a car the day before, they could have sold it for twice as much the next day because their currency devalued in these waves, these big hits. The U.S. does that occasionally, but you know the Russian government, what they hold in cash reserves, you know we have a big debt. Billions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in debt. Russians don't have that. The Russian government has enough gold on hand gold on hand to pay their entire national debt. They have enough foreign currencies on hand to pay their national debt. They have tripled the cash, gold, and currency reserves to pay their entire national debt on hand. In other words, they're solvent and rich as a country, rich beyond belief as a country. And they're going to develop that wealth on a platform of an evolving democratic structure. Yes, it's immature. Yes, they're corrupt. Yes, so are we. Yes, so is every other democracy in one way or the other. But they're evolving, they're growing, they're learning. They've got 70 years to untangle in misunderstood world of what was outside. That takes time. It will change. It will continue to change. They're not the threat they were. They're not a threat at all. Russia wants to make money. They want to do their thing. They have a sphere of influence. It's over there. It's their old republics. If we don't like that, that's too bad. We have a sphere of influence too. The people within regions need to sort these things out. Yes, we can help, but we've been interfering too much. We've been demanding too much. And there's a balance in all of this. And at home, we're neglecting our own. We don't have a justice system that works. We don't have a school system that works. We have a medical system that's embarrassing. We have places we call the third world with higher ratings in health care than ours. I travel every once in a while to Ecuador. I get my teeth done there. I can't afford to get it done here. All right, I have to go there. I get a great dentist who uses U.S. equipment, German equipment, all U.S. and German supplies. Really good. But I can afford to get the work done. I can't do it in my own country. What the heck? I at least can get there and do it. But their health care is better than ours. It's rated higher than ours by the World Health Organization, Bloomberg, and others. Less infant mortality, more accessible, more efficient than ours. You know, come on. Is that supposed to happen with 18% of our gross national product going to medicine and we can't make it work? These guys spend 7%, like a third less, a third, and get more of a better outcome wrong. China and Russia, people are tough. They're really tough. They're tougher than we are. I don't want to be in a war with those guys. They're tough. They're used to suffering a lot. We're not used to suffering very much at all. We're all victims waiting for the next thing to rescue us. Come on, folks. That's not our character, and that is not who we are. There's going to be changes, I think, too. People don't like being suppressed, and in China that's certainly still the case. Eventually they're going to get fed up, and they'll figure it out. Russia is in change. I think we can expect a lot of different things if we don't make them our enemy, unless they do something that is truly a violation of our space. And yeah, they're bouncing in and out of Alaskan airspace. It's not new. It's been happening since I was a kid. It's part of the Cold War that we still didn't get over. Alaska's going to make its trade routes. It's going to go over the poles into Europe because those oceans are opening up. It's going to go to Asia and the Pacific Rim, but not the U.S., because there's no way to get our stuff to the rest of the country. Unless we change it, all of it's exported, folks. No value added because there's nobody here still after 100 years. It's only 700,000 people. We're not going to build the plants and the factories and all that in Alaska, not for another couple hundred years. So it either goes to someone else or we do the value added in the United States, and that's going to require a whole new initiative. And alluded to enough in the course of the dialogue to get it in. But we've talked a little bit about capitalism and what it represents, the 4 factors of economic production. And I want to remind you what those are. It's not the cash between the fiat or the Bitcoin or any other medium of exchange. They're called mediums of exchange, and they're based on the full faith and credit of something. Bitcoin on belief, I guess. The US dollar on the full faith and credit that you have in the United States, whatever that might be. Because there's nothing else behind it anymore, and really that isn't behind it much either, because in the United States, our money is not printed by the Treasury in the way that we think it is. It's managed by the Federal Reserve Bank, which is 300 member banks that decide economic policy. It's bankers that decide this. Now, why is that important? Because they set the interest rates the banks get to collect and what you get to pay on debt. Now, isn't it kind of odd? You create money out of nothing and interest out of money that was created out of nothing, and then we take our productive wealth and hand it to bankers in the form of interest for money the government should have printed in the first place and not given any interest to anybody. Right? So we're paying a national debt on money we shouldn't have allowed someone else to print. Now, when did that start? It started in 1913. I want to go back a little ways to the 1890s when the United States Supreme Court ruled that taxing a person's labor was slavery. The U.S. Supreme Court. That's why we couldn't have income tax. No way could you attack. That's like grabbing you and saying, you know, but they started and said, well, it's only going to be 1%, but they still couldn't get away with it. The Supreme Court said, sorry, you're not doing it. So they had to amend the U.S. Constitution, and they did. 1913, that brought the income tax in. Before that, it was slavery. We gave it a new name. We gave it a new name. That's all. Because then, when we invented it, okay, as a new name, it wasn't going to affect the average guy who was voting, not pulling a lever, but scratching something on something. Okay, why? What happened there? Why would they do that? Why would they pass an income tax? Well, it was only going to be 1% if you made over $25,000. Well, most people were making, if they were lucky, $10 a week. So everybody was thinking, that ain't going to affect me. And the top rate was 6% if you made $500,000. Now let me put this into perspective. You have to multiply those numbers by 60. You'd have to make $1.5 million in today's dollars to pay the first bit of tax. Now, would anyone object to that today? Probably not. And if the top rate were 6, if you made $500,000 back then, and that would be $30 million a year today, I don't think most people would have much to complain about. But it isn't that way anymore because it eked its way in and got a lot bigger. And for me, it's 35%. So I'm a slave to the government 35% of the time. That's my direct tax. That doesn't include the portion of everything I buy that has taxes in it, like plane tickets, gasoline, etc., etc., etc. When you really hammer it out, it's probably about half of what I make. They get half of my labor. Am I their slave? I guess I am. Back in the Greek time, anybody who earned wages was called a wage slave, because you didn't produce your own wealth from things that are wealth. Land and natural resources, labor and entrepreneurship, you know, these things we talked about earlier. We've been lied to about a lot of things. But when you think about the mechanism of capitalism, it's a good mechanism. It rewards innovation. It does all that. When the Russians came out of being communists, they thought capitalism was sort of a vulture thing. It was about how much you could steal from the other guy and get away with. They learned later that capitalism works when both parties kind of win. You can't have a total loser and a total winner because you don't get to see the customer ever again. You know, it doesn't work that way. But when you're taught that by propaganda for 70 years and a couple generations roll by, everybody thinks it until another generation rolls by. Now I make my living largely in things I sell in Russia. I sell a dietary supplement to Russia, makes most of my living in a year. And I can tell you this, they're tough to deal with. I've dealt with them a long time. I've made my living for 10 years this way, and I don't have a written contract. I have a handshake. I have honor. And so do they, the people I'm dealing with. That isn't always the case anywhere you do business. For me, it's the only way that I do business is with honor. I mean, you might have to have an agreement because someone might die and someone else might need to know what the heck you were doing. So you get things eventually, but that's been 10 years. We still don't have it written down. We know we got to do it soon because we're not getting any younger. But not out of trust, just out of the fact that somebody has to know what we did. But economics is more about those four factors, those important factors: labor, natural resources, capital, and entrepreneurship. And that's what we need to be thinking about as we deploy our cash into things, is think about the paper that you're buying if you're buying stocks. And why do I feel odd about that? I call it puff money. Because what they did is they set up a system called 401ks that now is like a big fire hose headed to the stock market. It's an amount of money that just flows into it every month in a big volume. But there's not enough quality stocks and quality value to suck up all that cash. So what happens is we keep paying more and more for stocks because we're competing against the dollars. We're not buying an asset that's producing a revenue stream that's going to pay you dividends. We have what are called burn rates now. How fast can you burn through the money before you make a profit? You know, Amazon was burning money for like 20 years. Now they're destroying every business in America because nobody's buying from anybody else. So this is, you know, so, and guess what? The U.S. mail is subsidizing them. In my neighborhood, they're delivering Amazon packages on double time on Sunday. You want to know why the post office is losing money? Because they're in the wrong business. You know, the post office used to be the Pony Express. Used to take a year to get a letter. Why do we get mail delivery when no one hardly uses it anymore? We need mail delivery, first class mail, but probably not every day. Why not just cut it in half? Here's another key. Cut U.S. mail delivery to 3 days a week. Do them in 10-hour shifts. And the entire delivery fleet is cut in half if you eliminate packages, because there's plenty of private companies that can haul packages. And the only time a post office should haul a package is where companies don't go within the United States. And here in Alaska, there's plenty of places like that the post office goes, but nobody else does. So there's ways to rethink this. If you look at how much we're losing per box mailed for Amazon, it isn't get a bigger truck and move more boxes at more losses per box. That's the American way of handling the post office. Oh, get some more trucks. No, reassess the rate, because obviously we're too low if the private sector can't compete at all in that arena. You know, you can bid with them. You know, they'll compete with each other. A lot of people don't know that. I got FedEx and UPS to bid against each other when I was shipping a lot of goods, and I got a 50% discount out of them. All right. Big companies can do this, small ones too. You just got to go do it. See what you can get. But I don't think we need to be doing it the same way today. We could have half the wear and tear on trucks, cut out all the overtime. All of a sudden have a real change situation there. Get rid of bulk mail. We don't save anything by it. Now it's all computer sorted. Doesn't matter how it comes. Why are we giving all that discount when it's not needed anymore? It doesn't serve any purpose anymore. There's nothing saved. So we have all these systems built that aren't changed for the wrong reasons. We don't need everyday delivery anymore. They don't need to be in the express business at all. Others do it way better. And they're competitive. So government's roles need to be rethought, old institutions rethought, economics in terms of how it really works. The internet's become a new shopping mall. I said this 20 years ago, and the guys, the tech heads, said, they got all offended, you know, because that was tech world. No, that's all it is now, is a shopping mall and a way to influence every single person and collect data like no one's ever seen. Slavery and taxes I've talked about. One of the other big things in the tax bill and the amendments and what came out of it back there in 1913 was another little trick called depletion allowances. Now this is an interesting one, because the mineral industry and the oil and gas industry was just starting, but the mineral industry was well established. They didn't like the idea of giving up their wealth to the government. So they slipped in something in the 11th hour called the depletion allowance. Let me tell you how that works, because it works in oil and gas and minerals. I'll be the beneficiary of this. Thank you, America. Take this away from me because we don't deserve it, but thank you. Thank you for giving it to me because I'm in the minerals business, headed that way. And this is going to make it possible for me to pay half as much as I pay now because of depletion allowances. And here's how that works. We get to value the property, and as we take the ore out, it's depleted at a certain percentage. So we deplete the amount, which is a tax deduction against the income. Voila, no income for half the money. That's how they do it, depletion allowance. Oil and gas does it too here in Alaska. So they can say, oh, we're not making any money, but if you take this and back that out, they're making way, way more money. Because they're not even depleting their resource in the case of Alaska. Remember, they leased that from us. It's depleting our resource. They shouldn't get the deduction at all. That needs to be revisited at the federal level. No depletion allowances should be allowed if they don't own the oil. Like in private wells on the East Coast and the eastern states, which owned their oil and gas and mineral rights when they got their land. The West didn't. They changed the rules on us later. So we didn't get that with the land unless you have these old patents like I mentioned earlier. So the laws change, so the states don't have the same set of rules. The resources under the land are treated differently. But when they're owned by the public, the private side shouldn't deplete them at all, and depletion allowances should be eliminated. It's a tax dodge that's been now 107 years old. It's time to take it off the books and recognize it. And when you take it off the books, it's also time to recognize there's something on the books that needs protected on the other side, the right to patent land when you've made discovery. Now the laws to do that are still on the books, but they haven't funded that in a congressional act in over 20 years. So the law's there, but they're not putting any money in, so you can't do it. So you can't perfect your titles if you're in the mineral business, if you hadn't already done it. And the laws say you can, but the funding doesn't go there, so you can't. That's a worthless law. Either have the guts to repeal the law and have the fight, or follow the law and fund it properly. But there needs to be a broader discussion of who owns the land in this country and how more people might be able to get some of that land to develop in a responsible way that puts wealth back in the hands of the people that are this nation. The idea of 501c3s I want to touch on briefly in the course of economics, because these are the tax dodgers as far as I'm concerned. People say, oh no, we need these tax exemptions so people will contribute. I gave away a lot of money last year and not any to nonprofits. I gave a lot of money away this year and none of it to nonprofits. Didn't slow me down. I don't think it will. People want to give because they want to. If they want to do something to avoid taxes, there's plenty of loopholes in those codes. Companies give money to nonprofits because they want to look good. They want to be recognized in their community of not being assholes. So they try to make up for it by being nice to people occasionally if they can figure out a way to do it. Nonprofits have been that tool, but a nonprofit, when you create one, a 501c3, you can't engage in political speech. Very important, because there are a lot of good people that want to form these good organizations, but what they lose in the formation of them is your political speech. Your ability to speak against the government or for specific laws or to lobby for legislation. Now, if you're a church and you've done a 501c3, you've lost your political speech. Wow. Did you mean to do that? Apparently so. You traded it for money. There's a little verse in the Bible about that if you're a Christian church with a 501c3, as most of you are. It says, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. In other words, pay your taxes, not figure out a way to dodge them. And if you had paid your taxes, just paid it, although I really have a hard time with all of that when it comes to religion, but if you had paid the taxes, you'd have your political speech, and you could be talking about the dysfunction of government, and you could be pushing for the kind of laws that change government, instead of just leaning back and letting it happen because you're afraid you're going to lose your tax-exempt status. Because if you lose it, you have to give away all those assets. That building has to go to another nonprofit. That's the rules. Okay. Now we need to change those rules because it's put a chokehold on someone we're supposed to trust to be a compass. And you sold out. Every one of you that took the 501c3 and gave up your right to represent the people you think you represent in front of a government that oppresses them. That's what you did. You traded it off for money. Go ahead. Do it. That's what you want to do, but don't take any moral high ground in my community when there's people dying in the streets and there's a building on every corner empty. Which two families did you adopt? What did you do to fix it? Now there's a few doing it. There's one up on the hill that did it. They testified against what I suggested, and there was a church minister testifying about that. What he failed to mention to everyone was his wife was making $180,000 a year, more than a U.S. congressman, running the homeless program to create a bigger industry in Anchorage. We got like 400 people working in homelessness here and 1,100 homeless. That's a pretty good ratio. If we just arrested the people violating the laws, the one urinating, raping, doing the crimes in our streets, you would probably have a 1-to-1 ratio. In fact, we just fire all of them and hand the other guy the paycheck and we're good because they can go get another job. You know, this is nuts. We're building an industry by building more homeless people. Look around. And now we've got a national policy to create more dependency. And we've got things coming that are going to change everything about everything. We've got currency controls coming. We've got an ability to manage all of your stuff so you don't have to worry. You'll just get your automatic check and you're sit in your house and don't worry, because there's more coming. And we're going to talk about that as we get closer to the end here. At the end, this is not new. I recommended that old history book, A New American History, still sitting here on the floor, by Woodard. This talks about banking from the beginning. We had banking issues in the beginning. In the beginning, we had a Revolutionary War and we printed our own money, and they were called Continentals. And there's a saying, most people forget it now because they don't hear it anymore. It says, not worth a Continental, meaning it isn't worth anything. It was worthless. The Revolutionary War got done and all the revolutionary patriots came home, and they came home with a bag full of nothing. They got paid with something that wasn't worth anything. There was no gold in the treasury to back it up. It was worthless paper. And so for the next 20 years, speculators ran around and bought it for pennies on the dollar. And then a president many years later who borrowed money from France in gold and paid those Continentals in full to all those speculators, but not to the patriots who died and bled for those Continentals. The bankers have been playing the game a long time, from the very beginning, cheating the very patriots that made this country happen. Look it up. It's in the history books, the ones you read that were written at a time when people still remembered, and they hadn't stripped that out so we'd all forget. When you look at the history of banking in this country, you see abuse by bankers all the way through the game plan. It's not happened any different here. There's the Rasmussen Foundation here, $700 million, more than the Mental Health Trust has in cash in their account. Now, they started with a banking family, the Rasmussen family. Tried to destroy my family in the early 60s, because the way they attacked my dad was, crush his economy with his 4 kids, he'll have to do something else besides service. Yeah, they felt guilty when they sold out to Wells Fargo, and you all know about Wells Fargo, what a great success they've been for the consumer. Well, when they sold out for $900 million, more or less, half of it they put in the Rasmussen Foundation, and they have to give away 5% every year in Alaska. And I'm glad they're doing it. It's their blood money for all the lives they ruined. I'm glad they're doing it. But they have way too much influence, and they don't pay a penny in taxes here. And people ask about that. Well, what happens when you get so rich? Money doesn't mean anything. Then it's all about power, you see. If you're going to give your money away as a nonprofit because you're such a generous man like the Rasmussens, you shouldn't have control of a penny of it when it's gone. It should be gone to someone else. You have no one on the board. You have no way to influence it, because otherwise, all you're doing is using that to further your power in other arenas, because people know that's 700 million. And if their community is going to get anything, they might want to listen to you. And you're going to get a lunch. And the lady that runs that operation was mad as hell at me, calling me on the phone, first with all her little minions, because she didn't want to call me directly, and then me. And she wanted to get involved in a meeting with the governor that the governor had called. And I said, hey, what are you calling me for? Call the governor, it's his meeting. What did she want? She wanted me to shut up and not say what I thought. And you know what? No nonprofit is going to tell me anything, because they don't even pay a dime in taxes. But they take money out of this state. The Rasmussen Foundation hands it out to gain power for people that don't deserve it, and to get even for the guilt they carry for all the damage that family did here. That's how I look at it. There's an ad in my family's archive. You can see it. He's standing in one of their branches saying, hey, these are the guys screwing Alaska. And he was right. Because there was a time when there was only a couple of banks here and a few S&Ls. And they wouldn't help you at all unless you were lined up with them. That's changed. It's changed a lot, but it's still the same in a lot of ways. The US dollar, I've mentioned enough, it's in deep trouble. I talked about the Treasury. I want to talk to you about one of the best ideas that we could have had, and it came from my eldest son, that we could have really done something when we first came into this pandemic. When they were looking for a way to help people, let me tell you the easiest way that we could have done it. The US Treasury, not the Fed, but the US Treasury, or the Fed, it could have been them, they could have bought up every mortgage in America and reissued them at 0 interest rate. They gave 0 interest to the banks for nothing backing up the money they gave them. What they could get from us, 0 interest rate on our mortgages backed up by real estate. In other words, an even transaction, not just puff money out of nowhere. We get 0 interest. Now that would have saved people hundreds of dollars, not once, but every single month. What we could have also done for renters is say half of that savings for owners has to be done in rent deferral to do it. Wow, how easy would that have been? And it wouldn't have cost the Treasury anything. It would have all come back. Yep, no interest would have been made. They're not getting any from the bankers, and we bailed them out twice. And with our children, as I mentioned earlier, we've enslaved them for 20 years to pay off student debts while freeing bankers every time they screw it up. No, we did it wrong. We could have done it differently. Instead of forgiving bankers, why not free millions of Americans to freedom again, where they have that money to spend in the economy? If we had done this, and 200 or 300 or 500 or 700 were freed up in interest payments that weren't being made, the interest on this house is more than half of what I pay. It's $800 a month. I pay $1,700. I could have had that to spend somewhere else in this economy. And so could everybody else. And then they're buying things and their people are working. It's not going into the stock market and to puff. It's going into real things. The 401k fire hose has inflated the market to where it's just going to keep going up, and then about every 10 years it's going to get reset. Everybody's going to lose their money, and then it's going to start all over because the fire hose continues. There needs to be other ways to put your money in real assets, not paper, things that you can touch. There needs to be a rethinking of retirement programs so you can invest in things like local real estate, local businesses, where you're a part of that, where you see the real meat on the floor, the real stuff in the program. You see what's going on there. So the mortgage idea of my son's would have been brilliant. It's not too late. It would do great things for the country if anybody was smart enough to see it, and it's not that difficult to see. It just takes a little bit of effort. And maybe you have to charge 0.25% interest for the cost of servicing the loan, because there's a cost there. But it wouldn't be much. Wouldn't be much at all. So there's an opportunity to do something different. One of the things my brother, the only Democrat in the U.S. Senate at the time, to vote for an audit of the Federal Reserve System. You know, since they were formed in 1913, they've never had a full audit. Bernanke called my brother Mark, screaming at him when he was a U.S. Senator, "We self-audit, we audit internally." And he said, "Great, then you won't have any problem with an external audit either on them." Well, they don't want an audit. They had a partial audit that only covered a few years. And you know, when we thought that the Fed had bailed things out at about, banks out at about $1 trillion, yeah, they were right. But what didn't show up until that report came out, that audit came out, you can look it up, the Fed audit, look at page 131, and it'll tell you, we gave $16 trillion away, most of it to other banks. Weird things we were doing with those other banks. One of those things that we were doing, I think, is putting money in foreign banks for them to buy up dollars to keep the dollar from going into a free fall. That's what I think we did with that $16 trillion. I think we did a lot of things because bankers do it without oversight. Nobody knows. But they hold in their hands the value of the whole economy, and they're bankers and no one voted for them. No one elected them. No one put them in the position to have that much power, but they have that much power over us. So, the Treasury needs to be returned to the Treasury. The Fed needs to be audited. We need to find out what's happening with all that money and where it all went and why it all went. That's really it on the economy. I'm not going to say more about it. I have a couple of issues I still want to cover before our time is up, and I want to get through this tonight, and we're going to get through this tonight. I want to talk about religion a little bit. I've talked a lot in and out of this. The state of Christianity in particular, and I've talked about brands, and I really think the brand name sucks. We've really screwed it up. And the reason we have is because too many things have been destroyed in the name of Christianity for the last couple thousand years. And we got a bad rap for good reasons, because a lot of bad things have been done in the name of God. And it's not just Christians, it's every single religion, whether you're Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, I don't care. There's been too much death in the name of God. And God doesn't need your help or mine. God is really good at figuring that out without our help. And the arrogance to think that we're somehow God's soldiers in some war, you're out of your mind. We're not. The creation will take care of itself in that way. The next revolution on this planet will be a very different one. Yeah, I expect there's going to be some really difficult times that we're facing, because there are. There's no doubt about it. But in the end analysis, if you look at even the Christian faith, its own book, the Bible, it says very clearly at the end of the day, you'll have a form of godliness, but deny the inner power of it. Look around. We're there. There's no power in most of these churches. There's no real belief there. There's a lot of doubt. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of, more importantly right now, there's a deep need for leadership and honesty. And that means it's time for a rethinking of what we're doing, a re-examination of who we are within our belief structures. Whatever we consider sacred, a re-examination of the sacred is well in order. I sat under a minister at one time, a man, and I'll name him Eric Hewlett, and he was one of the very few Christian ministers that I ever sat under that I felt got the idea. And he ended up his career, I chased him down a few months ago to find out what he had done in the last 20 years, and he ended up being a minister to ministers. But he had a job the whole time, paper hanger, and an Assemblies of God minister, but there was no building program. The space was rented, only minimally. Not some big production happened. And then he was a minister to ministers. But the basic idea was you had a job, and he did. He ran a flower business supplying florist supplies and stuff. And he still does to this day. And he had a ministry too. He had a job, and he emulated the life of Christ, and I learned that from him. That's what he did, and he lived it full all the way through his whole life. Affected a lot of people positively, including me, because he lived a truth in a true way that was easy to see. He didn't have to say a word. He just had to be who he was, and that was enough. That's where we started this too, is just be who you are, that's enough. And there's a lot of people that you're not guilty for not knowing, but you are guilty when you know something and you say something different. Don't do that. So be your own truth, pursue it the way you believe you should pursue it. Don't listen to everyone else's story, and here's what's happened. This week got released by Gallup. In 1937, 73% of Americans participated in a weekly religious service of some kind. Millennials today, it's 36%, less than half. Why? What did the survey really say? Institutional distrust. Nobody trusts the churches. The moral compasses are gone because they don't have one anymore. They gave it up for tax deductions. So they can't be the compass that we need in the way that's needed right now, with honest, straight talk. We've lost confidence in government because they're just a bag full of bribery with a new name, and so few statesmen left. and just a bunch of parrots parroting special interest nonsense. You have to start taking it on one person at a time, working with each other, try to find the candidates that you can believe in, start at the local level, find people you can believe in, encourage them, and then learn how to lead from the standpoint of lifting. You know, the principles that we've been talking about today are all about that. And in the pages I have left, we're going to now talk about the technology, which most people thought is where we were going to start, and it's where we're ending today. Because this is where my work in the world, for most of the people that are listening today, started, was on technology. So I'm going to start with things I think are maybe the biggest things to be concerned about. And the first one is artificial intelligence, AI, which is getting a lot of press now, but it has in my lexicon for a couple of decades. They can tell more about you than you know about you. They can push you around and do it, and it's going to get better and more refined and more perfect the more information is collected. The goal is to collect everything, to know everything about you so you are totally predictable. And that's where we're headed, for commercial reasons and for other reasons. The commercial reasons are obvious. China's reasons are obvious. They're the same outcomes, the same systems, different justifications for having them, but they result in the same thing, a more directed and controlled society. I don't think we want that. To gain our privacy back, we have to stop the digital doorway being kicked in. It happened gradually. None of us understood it while it was happening, but we can clearly see it now. Are we going to have AI running our lives by dissecting us into something that we're not, and then treating us and herding us like cattle into whatever belief system they're trying to capture us within? Because that's really what it's about. It's about the reality industry. It's about taking your data and then creating a new narrative, they call it. You know what a narrative is? It's called a script, right? It's a script. It's like a play. They want a new narrative. What the hell are they talking about? We don't need narratives. We need lives with people living them, not making up scripts from focus groups and polling. This is what politics is. It's getting a little information from a focus group, figuring out what people want to say and see. We poll a few, we figure it out, and then we package it all up nice and neat so they'll swallow it all. Or we shove it up another way if they're not taking it the right way. And this is how it is. Your information used to manipulate you in doing what they can predict you'll do. Is that democracy? Is that a republic? Is that a life worth living? It's a life worth changing. It's a life worth grabbing back and taking back. Technology, the second one on the list, robotics. Everybody's worried about the robot taking your job, right? Because a robot at McDonald's will do 300 burgers an hour. An hour. And they don't file workers' comp claims and they don't complain. And now you know what they're doing with robotics? They're making robotics that are self-repairing and self-replicating so they can make more of themselves and fix themselves, and they don't need you involved at all. And because they can evolve their program so fast, we can't even keep up with them. If they have a bigger problem, they can probably unknot that too. Because it's not about feeling or believing for robots. It's just about how do we fix the widget. And that's not much deciding, but they're really good at it. And that wipes out a bunch of jobs. It's not just the guy at McDonald's. 9,000 bankers in one institution got wiped out and replaced by AI that now decides who's qualified for loans, and you don't have a personal banker involved. You have an algorithm looking at your picture as it's painted in the world of data bits, all those data bits. And that decides what your credit score is, which is similar to a social score, if you think about it. That's what's going on. Robotics are here. Think about drones as a technology. I was making drones in 1980 at Texas Instruments. Now, people didn't know there were drones 40 years ago, I'll bet. And they were the kind that you'd kick out of an airplane and they'd hover. They were anti-radiation drones, so they'd pick up radars. And they would determine which radar they had. Was it a fixed radar station, a mobile station, or what? Because in order to get an airplane out of the sky, you need to triangulate a position. So you either got the radars to shut off because there was a drone circling that had a charge on its nose, and when it got to a certain elevation, it would say, ah, now I'm getting you. And that's how it works. So it's a denial system. Either turn the radars off and you didn't worry and your planes made it by, or you turned the radar on and you lost the radar, and that was the end of the story. So we were making them back then for NATO and for Turkey and for the Navy, and then we were doing the HAARP missile for the Navy. That was a project I was on, but this is a big building with a lot of little pods running off of it in Carrollton, Texas. So technology even then was pretty amazing. That factory didn't get duplicated in terms of efficiency until they were building factories in China in 2000. Before that, the factory I worked in for Texas Instruments was the most modern factory in the U.S. at the time for electronics, for big electronics like we're talking about. Warfare in the future won't involve people. Think about it. Drones already are in the game, lots and lots of them. They make the decisions. There's an operator in Missouri running a drone in Afghanistan, killed a few people this afternoon, hit the barbecue after work. But that got pretty disturbing, so they started distorting some of that, so you didn't see what you were doing quite so clearly. Kind of cartoonized it a little bit, so you didn't feel so bad about who you were killing that day. But when it's easy to kill people, we'll kill a lot more of them. The reason that people came back from World War I, particularly, even the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, they didn't want their kids seeing what they saw, living through what they saw, Afghanistan more recently, Iraq. They don't want their kids doing that. They do everything they can to avoid war. That's what military people with experience in combat do. They don't want their families in that. They expect their government to keep them out of that every chance they get and not put our sons and daughters in harm's way. Because most of these wars aren't for us. They're for industry. We're not gladiators for industry. That isn't what we are. We weren't about meddling in everyone else's business when we formed this country. We were about creating a different place that people would see as a witness to the world that you could have a government by the people, of the people, and for the people. So others would be encouraged to try the same thing, have their own revolution in their own country. And we interfere with it every time it happens. At the Mexican border, they've tried a couple times to have revolutions there. Clinton stopped them back when it was on the Yucatan Peninsula. He stopped them. We interfered. We sent money. Shouldn't have done that. You think they didn't have a right to get rid of their corrupt government at the time, their drug cartel-infested government? Now their solution was in their government. They got 200 of the people in the AG's office implanted with a microchip to track wherever they went, and everybody went, 3 cheers, we got rid of the corruption. No, you didn't. Now they could never blow the whistle on everyone or anyone, because every move at the top, everyone was tracked. And it wasn't to make you safer in Mexico. It was to keep track of them so nobody was telling how corrupt it really was. So here we are, we back the play of these corrupt governments and wonder how come their people, 10% of the Mexican population, is running across our border. Why not? You know, I mean, people want to live free, but if we're supporting this, how come we had a problem in Iran? Because we put the Shah there. We interfered with elections in the 50s. We put the Shah of Iran there, and he killed lots of people. He was a bloodthirsty guy. When he got in trouble because they revolted, because he was revolting, and we did this, and they were mad at us, and we go, how come they're mad at us? That's why they were mad at us. CIA did that. Look it up. Why was there an Osama bin Laden? Because the CIA made him when he was fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. You know, we got to look back in history. We create our villains, people that don't represent American values. Why are we doing that? Why are we in places where we have to bribe governments for cooperation? They're not a threat to us. Do we need to be there? Do we need 800 military bases? Russia has one off of their own property. and it's sitting in Syria, as I understand it. We have 800 all over the place and get upset anytime anyone else goes anywhere. What are we doing, and are we the world's police? We didn't start that way. We were going to be an example, not a baseball bat for the world, an example of something different. And that's what we've forgotten in all of this. The ease of killing will just make more of it. I've talked about systems of control and quantum computing. I've talked about how powerful quantum computing is. Put that on this matrix we've been talking about, and freedom's gone. We're at the 11th hour on a lot of this. It's not over with. It only takes one, the right one, people who step into their gifts and their potentials. Lots can change. I've talked about the power of technology. I've talked a little bit about the Revolution of Military Affairs, the RMA, but I want to mention it again because it was too brief. The RMA was done by the U.S. Army War College in the 1980s, and it was looking at technology that was coming. A lot of the technologies that I've talked about over the years on privacy, particularly privacy. And what they said in this paper is that the public would never stand for these technologies because they violated the Constitution of the United States. However, they said, the U.S. Army War College, remember the training our officers, but there's a way around this. Now think about this for a minute. They first say it's going to violate the Constitution, but it's important enough to kind of forget that. I don't want them training any of my military officers representing me in the world. I want them believing the Constitution does matter. And what they said is the way they could avoid that is they create an environment of fear generated by international terrorism and international drug trafficking. Now you look at the column inches. Now you look at the column inches in what happens in that regard. Hundreds and hundreds of papers covering international drug trafficking and international terrorism. And you know, international terrorism as a single item in terms of killing people, didn't kill as many as medical malpractice last year in America alone. And how many inches of newsprint got medical malpractice? I can't remember any articles unless there were really crazy ones, like somebody scratching their initials in somebody's stomach or some stupid thing like this. But short of that, I don't see it. It's not reported. But what we've done to shut down American freedom for fear of terrorism sure has changed our lives. What we've done in all of these areas have changed our lives. And in that, when I think about this, again talking about technologies, what they were talking about were technologies that were so different, so radically different, that what they would create in the future is a technocracy, because it would be weapon systems that weren't bullets and bombs anymore. Be electromagnetic systems designed for controlled effects, what the electromagnetic of the Air Force had developed. What these controlled effects represent in us now is 5 things. They looked at all of our 5 senses and overriding those, as I explained earlier, but also systems that would attack hardware, the computer systems that operate equipment, that would operate the computer systems, that would operate the controls, and a way to override that by sending in energy, pulsed energy in such a way where it would create bit errors on the computers, cause them to fail, cause them to fail and not operate, or more, cause circuits to literally melt, or very subtle energies that would override the operating system of the human being, which in fact was the operating system where the mind has no firewalls. And that's an article, and I mentioned it earlier, you can look it up. It's by Perimeters, a publication for the military, and it's actually the translation of a Russian article. There's also one that I had a number of years ago of a Chinese article, and these are Russian-Chinese military papers that made it into circulation. And they talk about all the different ways to affect the mind. There was a special on CBC TV in Canada, on one of the most well-watched programs in Canada, that talked about mind control, and I was a part of that. When they interviewed the folks from the Russian side, they used a method for sending a noise out on the street, like white noise, and in it were subtle messages that caused people working on the street to come in at various times of the day and deliver little cakes, which they use at tea time. And so all that was going on based on mind control effects that were being operated by essentially this group of experimenters. But they did a lot of things. They did one that was called the 25th frame effect, which every 25th frame had a message in it that would be absorbed and remembered by the person observing it. When you think about the whole idea of influencing what's in the brains, this is like one of the major areas of military interest. And I talked about some of this earlier, the idea of looking at what a person is thinking and then influencing behavior. What they were thinking about there was a couple things. One is as a way to communicate with your own troops covertly and quietly. And the other was to disrupt the thoughts of your adversaries to confuse them. That's always been part of the program. If you can affect the human being, then all the equipment they have is worthless. So if you can use small amounts of energy to influence the operating system of a human being and shut them down, essentially you don't destroy anything in the battlefield physically that you're going to have to replace except for human beings. But they become the collateral damage and the property is saved. These kinds of weapons that are being developed were being developed at one point between the military and the Department of Justice in the guise of non-lethal. They didn't kill, but they could affect people. So they had a joint initiative. It started in the 1980s, continued through the 90s, where they transferred from DoD, Department of Defense, technologies to police departments around the country, various kinds, and they continued to do that in the non-lethal realm. Again, a way of moving this out of the federal hands and into the general public use. Military and Department of Justice, the overlays. Starting in the 1980s, a lot of this was done through Johns Hopkins University. In terms of non-lethal weapons, they held one of the big studies in this area was done at Johns Hopkins. They're the same ones doing a lot of this COVID stuff right now, just by coincidence. But these are government contractors, something to remember. The Freedom of Information Act requests don't apply to these contractors, and these nonprofits or universities are contractors too. That's where the holes are that need to be filled, especially in the area of technology. People not being trained in science in the government right now, in Congress, they go into a closed hearing, no notes, no staff, no conversations. This is really not governance when technology decides who's strong and who's weak in the world in terms of countries. Energy weapons I've talked enough about. I've talked enough about a lot of that. HAARP I won't revisit a lot. I'll just talk a little bit about it just because it's part of my original work. I have a lot online at Earth Pulse on that. There's a lot online everywhere on that. But what it really was that caught me is HAARP was this big system that would electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way to affect populations over a whole hemisphere. That's what J.F. Gordon McDonald was talking about in the book by Zabinski that I quoted from. When you think about all of this and you think about the effects of systems, when we're talking about literally manipulating a part of the environment and changing it deliberately from a DC to an AC current, taking the entire energetic system and alter it from direct current to alternating current, where it's pulsing at a very specific way to have a very specific effect, and to be used as part of a weapon system. Think about it, HAARP as a primer on a bullet. It's the bullet and the gunpowder where the real explosion is. So think about the environment as being the part of the bullet where the real explosion is. And man is the primer. And we're playing God in the universe right now, in the earth, with technologies at a level we've never done before, with transparency that isn't there across many platforms. HAARP for me was a beginning, and it's changed a lot. The technology's altered. What I will say is the direction of energy warfare is the direction of modern warfare. You see it playing out Robotics is moving in to fill the place of humans even there. People are being replaced with machines everywhere. Where do people fit in this culture now? Where are we going to fit in 10 or 20 years? And what are the possibilities that our children have? That's kind of where we're headed. You know, some of the other areas I haven't mentioned or spoken about in my other books. Underwater sonar is another area that's being affected a lot. You see the beachings all across the world. Those are low frequency sonars and others within the oceans operating. I did a lot of that work back in 2002, 2003. When Jim Roderick was still alive, I was invited to a conference in Bar Harbor, Maine with a bunch of PhDs in environmental sciences, and they wanted me there, and it was a Marine Mammal Commission that put this together, and some universities, and they wanted me there to talk about energy weapons as such, and from the broader perspective, and then within the oceans. And what we do with sound waves in the oceans, they travel very efficiently in water. And so marine mammals like whales, they can hear low frequency sounds over many, many miles, 3,000 miles of ocean. And the reason they can is in the oceans you have salt levels that are different with depth and temperature levels, and in a certain level you can create like a signal barrier which keeps the signal trapped, so it carries a long distance. And whales communicate this way with sound, but it's very quiet, subtle, certain frequencies that transmit easily. Then what we do as humans is we introduce sonar, which is the equivalent of putting a megaphone next to that whale's ear and talking really loud. It blows out their eardrums, how they hear and how they orient. And that's why they beach. When they do the investigation and they open them up and see, it's hemorrhaging that happens. The same kind of hemorrhaging that happens when you race to the surface as a diver too fast. The same thing happens. Because they're being yelled at in a way that totally breaks the eardrum as all that energy transfers. Because in air, only a small amount of acoustic energy transfers. In salt water, most of it does. So the impact is a hammer. And this is what we're doing. Underwater sonars, yeah, we get to find the quiet subs now, but we wipe out the natural submarines that are already there. You know, electromagnetic fields, which is the big thing that we've talked a bit about, it's been our problem today is the fields that we're immersed in here, and we picked up some of it. You know, they're not working like we had planned. But there's a company, Swiss Reinsurance. They underwrite big insurance company risks, and they write risks all over the world. The risks they won't write, wireless. They will not underwrite for mobile phone companies or anyone else liability related to the wireless world, because the research already shows them, and this is from 2000, this is old. They were telling the industry it's going to be the biggest set of lawsuits someday. It's going to dwarf tobacco. It's going to dwarf Firestone and all the big litigation we've seen. Because this one is the big one. Wireless, they can't cover the potential losses. And you'll see it. It's already merging in our health statistics, lowering of our general health. You'll see more of that as time goes on. The answer will be energy medicine. I alluded to it. As the months go on and the years go on, and as I continue to report, there'll be a lot to report in these areas. I'm not going to report much more on that. I'm going to just talk briefly about a couple more things, and then we're going to be done. I have Tesla and new energy that I want to cover briefly because it occupies a lot of my cabinet there. But I want to talk a bit about hydrocarbons in the context of that. There's no shortage of hydrocarbons, although a lot of people will tell you we're running out of oil. They've been telling us that in Alaska for a long time, and we're not. The real hydrocarbons in Alaska are locked up in coal, and there's a lot to be said about coal. I'll mention that briefly for a few minutes because I think it ought to be heard, because there is no shortage. We have enough coal in Alaska alone to run energy needs for about 1,000 years or two that we know about. Up to 2,000 years, enough BTUs that are known, British thermal units stored up in coal here. But coal they don't like to use, right? That's considered an ugly coal. But there's a technology that was developed by ExxonMobil, and the technology patents were owned by a company called Accelergy, and I worked with them for a while here in Alaska when they were trying to put together a coal to liquids project. Now, what does that mean? In World War II, Germany didn't have any oil, but they had coal, and they had developed the Fischer-Tropsch method for getting about 3 barrels of oil out of every ton of coal. That was one of the ways they were able to have a military, actually. What they've developed since is a way to get about 5.5 barrels of petroleum out of a ton of chunk coal. And what they do now is they do it way differently. They break it down molecularly into each element. So you get mercury and sulfur and carbon and hydrogen all broken out separately. And then you introduce some extra hydrogen like natural gas. You need about 40% of what a natural gas line would have produced, which is what they were trying to sell at the time, to feed one of these to get enough hydrogen into the mix. But then what they do is they reconstruct those molecules into synthetic fuels so they can get gasoline, diesel, JP8, and something called JP10, except in the form of a biodegradable fuel that'll break down in the environment without the damage that the other petroleum products generally produce. I don't know how that all works, but I know they can drink it and not kill you, and that is what the data shows. Now, why that's important for Alaska is we got all these rural villages that have storage situations that aren't always ideal. A biodegradable fuel would be a great idea for most places. Now, the JP10 offered something else, 20% more energy per gallon or per liter, meaning less fuel to get further, or more freight and less fuel if you're hauling freight, or more range for a drone, or more bombs instead of fuel for a plane. So JP10 would have made Alaska a great place to land when freight companies could move more freight for less money. All right, so we were pushing this. It had a 0 carbon footprint, which meant that to balance the load of what you were creating in carbon, the thing was you grew this synthetic blue-green algae that you squeezed the oil out of, you threw back into the process to be more efficient with the coal, and then the material left over was an organic fertilizer that was extremely effective, the blue-green algae left over. And then what you had is a 0 carbon footprint. It neutralized, it went to 0, or you could even add more blue-green algae and make it even a net gain to reduce carbon. So you could manage that, so you had a 0 carbon impact. Then people worry about coal dust and dams breaking. This didn't create any coal dust. What you had at the end was something called bottoms, which was a tar-like material that was mixed with gravel, and you got asphalt that paves roads. No waste, everything used. Took a square mile to create a plant, but it would have produced 20% of what the Trans-Alaska Pipeline produced in petroleum products of a biodegradable nature, and used a hydrocarbon to do it. It didn't happen here because China had 18 plants they wanted to convert, and here it would have been a 10-year regulatory process. So in the middle of it, they left, they went to China and did it there. Not the end of hydrocarbons, but they are changing. My bet is that within 20 to 30 years, it won't even be a hydrocarbon economy in the way it operates today. It'll be replaced with a better technology, something more in line with what Tesla had in mind. And what he dealt with was oscillating electromagnetic fields. Look at all of his patents and all of his work. It dealt with pulsating energy in different ways to create different effects. He did everything according to the literature from triggering earthquakes with electromagnetic fields, something that Elizabeth Rauscher, one of the best physicists in the world, did in her research, was knowing that certain signals were produced in advance and during earthquakes, and she predicted models that were really efficient. It was the last book she was working on before she died that didn't get printed, unfortunately. But energy is in abundance. This is something Tesla knew, that we could tap the vacuum, so to speak, and gain energy not from nothing, but from mechanisms that weren't well understood. We're there now. Those technologies are on the planet now, and they're going to come into general use in the next 20 or 30 years, and hydrocarbons are going to be gone. It's going to have a big impact on my region here in both ways. We're going to produce those metals that are necessary for that new technology, and the minerals are going to come from Alaska and a lot of other places. But oil and gas is going to be relegated to plastics and pharmaceuticals economically, because think about this. If you own a mortgage and a car and are living in the normal lifestyle of most Americans, you have debt, a lot of it. And probably a third of your money is being paid to government in the form of taxes, and a third of your money is being paid in interest, either directly to interest you pay or through all the businesses that pay interest on all the debt that they have. That's the banker's tax. They get a third of your life for most people in the West. The government gets a third of your life and you get a third for yourself. Isn't that wonderful? Do you feel free? Do you feel liberated? Are you happy about it? And it didn't start out this way. All of that was called slavery, and now we are all slaves to a system we allowed to be built around us. And now we're all locked in our homes, slaves and prisoners, and no one's bringing us groceries. We have to pay our own bill. How about that? Home of the brave, land of the free. Is it really? I don't think so. The Germans right now, when I used to lecture there and I said, you know when the power goes out and they'd all just have a blank stare, and now they don't have a blank stare. The fact that the whole economy is shut down. I used to produce a product in Germany. I moved it to Poland where the economy's open. And you know what? I'd never move anything to Germany again. They don't know how to run a government or an economy. Look at the mess they have. And the good thing they're all shut down because they've been shutting their nuclear power plants down and their coal plants down and putting up wind and solar. The problem is that you can't balance the power grid. Now they have power shortages. And if their industry wasn't bankrupt because they've been shut down for a year and a half and the power were on, they'd find out they can't even run the industries they had. And they're lucky they're not going to have them anymore, because at least they'll keep the home lights on because there aren't any factories running there until all the money runs out. And then Germany looks like it did a long time ago. Rethinking this, we've built an entire industry, and we didn't even touch on it, based on explosion. There's an entire way of thinking about energy based on implosion. It goes back to Callum Coates and a lot of researchers that were operating within Germany just before the war. And a lot of their ideas got lost in the shuffle. But a lot of those ideas are coming back. There's new ways to look at energy. That's going to be the currency of the 21st century, the balancer. Energy, when energy gets cheap enough and free enough, then you can grow all the food you need. Look at the Netherlands, what they grow in greenhouses to feed a good chunk of Europe. Doesn't take a lot of space. What it takes is the application of technology, the understanding of abundance, and ways to empower people again. And for the few, the 1,000, and there's only about 1,000 of the ultra greedy that are destroying this planet, we need to get a count. We need to open up the doors of transparency. We need to create whistleblower mechanisms that go against corporations and individuals and governments that work against what's good for human beings. And there ought to be a way to do this differently in a complex world, and I believe there is. One of the last things I want to talk about in the general sense, I want to talk about climate change, because that's another big one that we hear everything about. And I'm not going to get in a big argument. I'm just going to point out a few facts. Fact number one, an ice age ended 12,000 years ago. Fact number two, oceans were 300 feet shallower then. They have risen 300 feet in 12,000 years. That's a fact. That's 1 meter every 100 years. That's a fact if you average it out. What the environmental community says is in 100 years we will have 1 meter deep ocean, going up 1 meter. Yep, been the average for 12,000 years. There were periods where it happened really fast, and there were periods where it happened really slow. All of those communities that used to exist are under the ocean. Look at the latest archaeology on what they're finding under the ocean from 300 feet up. The culture that went away. The one that died a long time ago. They just found in Turkey evidence of a high culture from 12,000 years ago that wasn't supposed to be there. Look around. Things have been changing a very long time. When you think about the oceans heating, and they use this, the solar radiation is doing it, it violates the laws of physics. Let me tell you why. When solar radiation hits the surface of the ocean, 97% of the energy is reflected off, and only about 3% of that energy is absorbed in the form of heat. And it stays right there on the surface, because you can jump in the ocean anywhere in the world, and as soon as you drop even a couple feet, the temperature starts dropping. It gets colder and colder and colder, because heat rises. It doesn't sink. So how do you get, when you look at those satellite maps of the South Pacific and you see these big plumes of energy coming out of the ocean and spreading out? That doesn't work from solar radiation. That does work from undersea volcanics. Because then 100% of the energy in the form of heat is absorbed in the ocean, and it comes up in a small amount and then drifts into a plume. And this is when atmospheric physicists do not talk to volcanologists, who don't talk to oceanographers, who don't monitor what's going on under the seas, because we don't. That's your heat source. 3/5 of the world is covered by oceans. Look at where all the volcanoes are, and then you can see them under the sea, because they have the topography now. You can see where they all are. They're huge, they're big, they're everywhere, and we're not watching any of them. And when they dump the heat heats up. Now, there was a time in the 80s, maybe it was the 90s, where we had 15-degree temperature increases in our part of our state. And they said, we can't understand this. We can't understand this at all. Well, it's easy to understand if you put this into the equation. And then somebody could have went and looked for it, because there had to be a source of heat coming from under the sea to be absorbed into the sea, or it would just be on the surface. And it wasn't. Think about it. Heat goes up, cold goes down. It's impossible to do it the way they're telling us it was done. Ozone depletion. You know, every time we launch a satellite, we deplete ozone for a huge area. None of that was factored in. At the time I wrote, over 20 years ago, 3,000 rockets responsible for ozone depletion. The first time we noticed it was when we launched Skylab all those decades ago. And it made a big hole in the ozone layer, but after a number of hours, everything was cool. It filled back in. So, okay, that's all good. No, it isn't. It's like taking a rock and throwing it in a pond. It makes a little bit of space for a couple seconds, fills back in. Yeah, okay, maybe that works. Maybe that's true. But if you actually change the chemistry and the ozone's not there, only thing that happens is other ozone fills out at a thinner level, which explains ozone depletion over time, right? Okay, so there's more to it than what meets the eye. The refrigerant units, the refrigeration units that they blamed, those are heavier than air. They sink. They don't go up either. Methane does. Methane is released from tundra, heating up, which it's been doing, I might mention, for 10 years. Where we're sitting, there used to be about a mile of ice above my head 4,000 years ago. It's gone. There wasn't any cars running when it left, I can promise. And it wasn't here 150 years ago, I can promise. But there was a lot of ice around here that you can see in those old images, because 40% of the glaciers have gone away in recent time of what was here then. From then to now, what you're not considering is what was there before to then. And that's where the big heat happened, and it wasn't in the last 150 years. What I would say is the same is true. Start analyzing the motion and the position of what people are doing with all of their information today. Climate change is a big one. If you want to get funding in the world, you better put climate change in it if you're involved in science, because then you'll get the money. But if you're going to be critical of the science, you won't get anything. But if you look at BBC's work on this before it was trendy not to have the opinion, they did do a story. And what they said is very accurate, that if you look at the solar cycle and climate change, there's a bit of a lag, but they run just like that. If you think that it was man, then you would think that from World War II on, it would have been really nasty what we were doing, because a lot of industrialization happened, most of it. And you know, temperatures continued to drop until the mid-80s, but they don't report that either. They weren't going up then, they were going down. These things cycle. I think we're going to find out the truth of it is 1 to 3%, and this is what the number is, are man-made pollutants that contribute to this. One good volcanic eruption in the surface puts way more particulate material than man will put in a year. So remember, nature is way bigger than we are. We have things to do because we're not doing it right. A lot of the things that we put in the atmosphere may not be responsible for ozone. Why I don't object? Because the particulates we're putting in the air are poisoning us in lots of other ways with nanoparticles so small they're absorbed even through the skin. And they are altering life on the planet. We do need to think about this all differently. We can be good stewards. We can have development. We can do all of this differently than what we've been doing. And I'm down to the end of this broadcast today. I'm down to my closing comments, and we actually did it. I don't know how many hours we finally ran, but I want to close with a few different things. I want to say this too. I started this work 50 years ago with some ideas, and those ideas were meant to inform me mostly because I was curious. And as time went on, I thought someday when I was gray, I would start writing, and I started writing 30 years ago and got gray doing it. And we're at the end of our time today. We've done a lot today. But what I want to say again is, we are the hidden monks. This is our time to remember our birthright, to remember the things our founding fathers came with. And our founding mothers, quite frankly, because nothing could have been done without them. All of us doing this thing together. We did it in a culture that wasn't balanced then, but is in a culture that balances itself out by recognizing it's a life of improvement. We're the hidden monks because we have something still to do, and we need to remember who we are. In the coming months, what will be my trajectory? It'll be to teach, to take each of these themes and expand them out a little bit further. And I want to say thanks for being with me tonight. You know, how I normally close my day is in a ceremony, of movement, of prayer, of gazing again. I do it in a prayer room for me, a space I set aside for just that. And I'm going to go in there with you for a few minutes. I'm going to kind of get rid of the microphone. I'm going to disconnect a little bit. I'm gonna gaze for just a moment. I'm not going to do my whole ceremony. I'm going to save that for another day. But I want to at least walk through the motion of where I go and what I would do and explain it. What I would do at the end of my day, a day like this in particular, this is one of gratitude really for me. I'm grateful for the fact that I got to do this today. That I finally got this off my heart and off my chest in a way that can kind of get a bigger picture of possibilities. That none of us are in it alone. None of us get out alive. We're all on the same installment plan to death. But once we leave this place, we got all the time in the world. But the time we have near is the time that matters. This is where time and space matters. Where we can come out of that lost nature of feeling helpless, gain our power back, step into the birthright that we had from the very beginning, we've always had, and reclaim it and change our lives. And with that, I close tonight with the beginning of my ceremony as I walk into my prayer room today, and kind of finish it off with you, thinking about the future, thinking about the possibilities, thinking about the fact that leadership, real leadership, should be able to have a conversation that goes deep, that goes broad, and has within it real solutions. This is where I come to wind down my day, and it's usually lit, and it's quiet, and it's calm. And you even hear the difference in the sound in this room. You should be hearing the difference as you pick it up. And it gets quieter, if you notice. It has kind of a deeper feel, and it's the acoustics in the room for sure, and it's the feel of the room for sure. Time to share with me, and the possibility of finding real solutions. And this is it. This is where we started. This is where it's going to end. Thanks for being with me, and thanks for joining me in a chance to make a difference. change your life. Make your life better. It's not my path, it's your path. The one you're on is the right one. Thanks for being with me today. And thanks for being one of the Hidden Monks. The voice. The voice, the deep tone of it, the vibration in it, carries the moment into form, in communion. Meeting another as the eyes fix upon the focus of the other. The gaze into the soul begins, and a connection forms into a chord, a flow, the way emerging. Into it you go, into the void that is not that. More than empty, in fact full, rich, and deep. The voice, the deep tone of it, the vibration in it. It pulls you into the thread of awareness. It is the awareness. The tone of it carries a form that has no form in it. Still, there is the emotion of it is present. Delivered into the intention, the coming together begins. The voice, the deep tone of it, the vibration in it, the gazing into the eyes of the other as the sound of soft words exchanged in a subtle, light way of coming into each. In that moment of seeing and connecting, the breathing moves to synchronize, the mind flows into a union. In that moment, the voice, the deep tone of it, the vibration in it, it communicates more than the words, shifting more than intention, and that unseen within. Then the filter hits of another. What comes through? The vibration, the emotion, the tone within the tone. This is what rings in us, that speaks to us, that changes us into seekers who are arriving in the now.
The Voice.